based on that.
Do you just want us to email you the briefing, the interview guide?
Yeah, the assignment's also available like this.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
Pretty vague enough, but also what we can do. Yeah, so I just put that, the potential problem at the top and has made my question, like, basically kind of replaced issue
He's so good at shit.
with the problem, so that hopefully that makes it more clear. Okay, that's all.
Yes, I'm good. It's okay, you'll get it.
Thanks.
I don't know.
Why I need to know. It's just kind of nice, but like, I wish it was a different color than I want.
Bro, if I want my
So it's like St. Patrick's Day for you right now, but it's not.
one of like Austin and I should have played some class. We should have played the site today and we didn't text each other, like, didn't talk at all. And we both walked in with different entrances. Like literally, bro. I like walked in, turned the corner, Milton turns the corner, and we just walked towards each other. Off the stairs, is it like, oh, should we come in the middle and just sit there? Because I left before you. I thought you might already be there, but I was like, I feel like it's been a long way. But I went to the bathroom. And then I came back, walked in, and you walked in at the same time. I was like, yeah, inside you went to the bathroom.
You
Yeah,
were
right
like
in the
before
building.
class. You said you were like,
Saw it. Bro, what does that remind me of?
imagine you lost it.
That reminds me of Weekend Club.
Of what?
That's what it reminds me of. It's like that one guy, it's like Weekend Club, but it's not as big as yeah, that's a. How do you do Weaver? You can only change one letter on that other time. So we'll probably speed. But still. Still. But that still. Seems like a single. Pretty happiness. Oh, you change the account. They're trying to get the spin. That's the idea. About stack. Then you gotta. Oh, I do this. It's and now he knows. Now you know.
You're making one?
Yeah, I know it.
Oh, I was about
First one I did. Wow. We started with the. Having a big. Our coach, and this is.
Not the one that I got. Because it's like. This.
I didn't like. I just, he just wasn't, get rid of, and then he jumped and then fixed. You know. We're having some. No, that is it.
Brock, it looks like I'm missing the presentation from you.
Oh my gosh. Can I skip today, do another day? Oh my.
We can talk later.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go ahead and get started today. I hope you all had a great long weekend, and I appreciate you all continuing to keep up with quizzes and other things as we get into close to the end of the term. So as we get back in today, we got kind of an interesting setup because today is actually our only full in-class meeting this week. We have Memorial Day on Monday, and then this Friday, just like last time, is an attendance optional workshop day. So you're welcome to come in if you want to, but you don't have to. Designed to prepare for application paper number 2. So application paper 2 is due this Sunday. Again, I'm asking you to pick one of the theories from the second half of the course, pick a different artifact, and then analyze that artifact using that theory. I'll try to turn around the feedback and grades on those as soon as I can, ideally early this next week. That way you have feedback on both of them and you can make a choice as to which of the 2 application papers you feel would be the best candidate to complete your final assignment. So last class, we got into cultural studies. So cultural studies, right, is the study of how broader frameworks and ideas about communication are circulated, including through the use of media, the role of power, the role of influence. You might recall the example, right, of the analysis of that 1980s film, They Live, where, the man puts on the glasses, he sees that some of the humans are actually aliens. He sees like the actual message behind an advertisement, right, where you look at something like a dollar bill and it says, "This is your God," kind of looking at the broader ways in which attitudes and goals are conveyed. And a key idea here with regard to that was blank, which refers to a mental framework for viewing the world. What is this blank? No, it's been a minute. Starts with an I. Yeah, Jack. Ideology, right? So ideology is like a pair of glasses, right? It's a broader mental framework for viewing the world, right? It might refer to a set of religious, spiritual, political, social beliefs that guide your understanding of issues, right? So one example of an ideology or ideological framework, right, is everything happens for a reason, or a belief in fate or karma, right, which might guide the way that you're thinking about and exploring the world. So cultural studies is a useful way to understand broader assumptions and beliefs. Today, we are going into muted group theory. So we'll introduce and discuss the impact of muted group theory on communication. So to get started, what I'm going to be asking that you do is you should have received an email this past week for evaluations for the course. So these course evaluations are really useful. They let me know kind of what's working well for you, what's not, and give kind of a framework for teaching either this or other classes in the future. So if you check your email, you should see an email requesting the completion of evaluations. And what I want to do is just dedicate a block of time for you to work on those on a device if you have a device with you. If you don't, I'd encourage you to think about finalizing your ideas for your second application paper. So I'm going to give you some time to work on that, or to work on evaluations for other courses if you haven't completed those yet. I'll come back in at about 11:10 or so, since me standing here while you're working on those might be a bit awkward. So please take some time to complete evaluations for the course. And I'll be back in just a little bit for us to get into and discuss muted group theory.
Next Monday. Yeah, I just.
Thank you for doing that. Again, if you did not have the chance to do that already, please do that by the end of the week. I appreciate your time and working on that. So thank you. As we're getting into new stuff today, I just want to give a brief reminder about the remaining courses and then the theories that you get to pick from, right? So muted group theory, optional attendance on Friday. And then this next week, we will be getting into our last three theories: structuration, feminist standpoint, and co-cultural theory. A few things to have on your radar as you're doing this, right? First of all, application paper 2 can pick any of those theories, including muted group theory that we'll be talking about for today. So I definitely recommend locking in that choice and really starting to think about what you want to develop here. And then the final research paper, again, is due on June 15th. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week, but I am asking you to make a significant revision to the paper, including at least three outside credible scholarly sources. Generally speaking, these might be sources that talk about your theory in greater detail or add more context to your theory in a similar way as what you've seen from our student presentations so far. And then I'm asking that you include a cover letter that describes the changes that you've made from your original draft and the way that you incorporated feedback from your original draft to the final version. So just so you know what's being looked for there. And again, a draft example of a cover letter is available for you to use as well. And then also know that there's an extra credit opportunity available too, where you get to pick one of the theories that we didn't get the chance to get to today, or get to in this course to explore further. So I would just remind folks that just the hard deadline for all of the remaining assignments is June 15th. So past that point, right, no more assignments can be turned in for the course. So I do recommend working to get that in by that deadline. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on muted group theory. As we get into this theory, does anybody have any questions about the second application paper or anything else about the course at this point? Great. So muted group theory is another one of those theories that is starting to look at the ways that we communicate in a bit more of a critical lens, right? Trying to understand the broader roles of power, ideology, the assumptions and guiding forces that govern our conversations and engagement with other people. So what this theory is looking at is just that, a group that is muted, that is experiencing some degree of discrimination or otherwise is not being fully included in the process of discourse and engagement in public. So muted group theory, right, is suggesting that language is serving the dominant groups who created it and those who belong to similar groups. And we can think about the development of language in a couple different ways. We can think about this in a very formal way, like literally creating the language, right? So, we're speaking English. There are people who are bi and multilingual who might not necessarily have the ability to speak their native language in a lot of their face-to-face encounters, right? We can think about the development of language, but we can also think about some of the ways in which more informal language and jargon is used too. For instance, how do you pronounce certain words? Is it soda? Is it pop? Is it pecan? Is it pecan? Right? Your responses to those questions and how you utilize language in your day-to-day interactions are also connected to dominant groups and the ways in which those groups develop a sense of shared identity through the use of language. In other words, if somebody is seen as not following what is considered to be the dominant group's language, so we can consider this both in terms of formal language choices and whether or not you speak the language, but also in terms of again some of the informal rules and guidelines surrounding that language, right? So, for instance, if you were to visit a country, perhaps you went to Europe, you went to the UK, right? Maybe the American accent you had would make people be less likely to take you seriously because they recognize where you're from and maybe come in with stereotypes or assumptions about being a foreigner from that culture, right? Or somebody perhaps has challenges with speaking English. They may have an accent, and as a result of that, they might experience kind of teasing, ridicule, or an assumption that somebody is less intelligent or articulate on the basis of language, right? So those stereotypes and assumptions that are put against people on the basis of language they speak or how they're able to speak that language. For instance, we might think about a lot of stereotypes that are made about people who might have language coming from the Midwest or the South, right? You might individuals might make fun of those language choices and assume that people were less intelligent on that basis. All of those things, right, are stereotypes that originate from divergence from a dominant group's language and language choices. So this is semiotic and critical in terms of its traditions, right? So it's semiotic in terms of how it's using symbols to communicate. What language or shared symbols are we using? How are we using and circulating those symbols together? It also is taking on critical and cultural contexts, trying to understand, first of all, critical in the role of power and how power influences our interactions with each other, and cultural in terms of how we develop a shared sense of language and identity together. So there was actually a play, a stage production. I wasn't able to find a clip of the actual production, but this came out a few years ago, called All in a Row, which was, it received really significant backlash and negative responses from people either who saw the play or heard of the play, right? Because the premise of the play, right, is it's about a family and it's about a son who is autistic, right? And the son, rather than being portrayed by a human character, was portrayed in this play by a puppet. So the kind of dehumanizing impact of treating the sort of experiences of disability and neurodivergence as rendering somebody not human or fully human, not able to speak, and even for folks who are nonverbal, right? There are a lot of other ways that they might communicate, engage, such as the use of written word, right? That gained a lot of criticism. And I think it is an example, quite literally, of muted group theory because it creates a situation in which someone has no agency, autonomy, or ability to speak because as they're depicted on screen, right, they're literally portrayed as a puppet. So muted group theory comes from Sheris Primare, who is a scholar of women's studies and communication, very much concerned with the role of gender and the ways in which gender is shaping our understanding of differences in how we communicate. So if we're looking at kind of a broad sweep of this theory really got its start in discussing differences in power related to gender, but it's kind of zoomed out to understand dominance of other groups through language in other contexts too. So, gender as well as other aspects of identity are also considered as we're talking about the role of power and group identity. So again, a lot of the origins of this theory are talking about gender and talking about gender-based differences. And one of those key assumptions here is the idea that women perceive and engage in the world in different ways, not on the basis of biologically determined factors, but rather on the basis of other factors that are cultural and based off of assigned roles that are given to people, including distribution of labor, right? Again, if we think about kind of the history of women's distribution of labor in the United States, we think about the kind of disproportionate ways that women are socialized into roles outside of professional work. But we have seen shifts in that representation in recent years through kind of households in which multiple people are working. We also know, right, kind of critiquing the binary way of understanding men and women. Obviously, there are identities who exist between and outside of those categories and relationships that exist outside of those categories as well. So what this is saying is not necessarily that there is a biological determinant of how women engage and perceive the world differently, rather that there are social factors and distribution of labor that are contributing to differences in these roles. In other words, experiencing a variety of challenges and perhaps experiences of discrimination across gender. Because of the kind of historical dominance that men might encounter in a variety of cultures and situations, as a result of that, our author defines this as a system of expression that's dominant and is one that prohibits or otherwise restricts the full expression of alternate models of communication, particularly related to women. And again, Sheris theorizes that for participation in society, women must transform models in terms of the received male system of expression, that is, to communicate in new, different ways that might challenge the way in which kind of dominant language is constructed. So one way of thinking about this, right, is to think about some of the ways that sort of metaphors, language, imagery are used. For example, the use of competitive language to discuss, winning a job, winning a battle, the use of things such as word metaphors that are oftentimes pretty highly gendered. Also, some of the ways in which, we think about the role of rhetoric and persuasion. Karen Foss, another major scholar in communication studies, put forward the idea of invitational rhetoric, where it's not so much about trying to persuade or dupe someone as much as it is inviting discourse, free expression, debate, and deliberation on different topics. So this theory kind of helps us to understand some of the ways in which power shapes differences in communication and language, and the chilling effect that can have on people's ability to articulate and express themselves. Another key scholar that is relevant to this theory, you might be familiar with Atari Spivak, who is a cultural scholar and theorist who kind of gained a large understanding of communication by studying the sort of caste system in India and the ways in which individuals who were not in political caste power uniquely found themselves marginalized and not able to fully speak to some of the experiences of marginalization that they encountered. So Spivak's argument, right, he asks, can the subaltern speak? Can somebody who is coming from this marginalized identity and lack of power have the resources needed to speak about their power and oppression and develop a framework for addressing and proposing alternatives? And Spivak's conclusion is, in a lot of circumstances, no. In a lot of circumstances, if someone is economically disadvantaged, somebody doesn't have a platform or use of media to speak and to advocate for themselves, we can't assume that they will be able to do so very easily. So, Spivak's argument is there needs to be structural elements that allow marginalized groups to communicate. We've seen changes of this through the use of social media. Again, I would look to the Arab Spring as a really major example where we saw political revolution and upheaval in numerous countries that came out as a result of people being able to use various forms of social media to get the word out. So a power base is informing who has created the language and who might have the most experience with expressing that language. Again, we can think about this a lot in terms of English and in terms of Indigenous and First Nation populations, right? We know that in a lot of cases, Indigenous people were forced into learning a language that was not their first language, that maybe did not identify with their culture and identity. And actually, many of the Indigenous tribes in Eastern Oregon have actually developed initiatives to try to teach children the native language, recognizing that many of their children are born speaking and developing language English. Right? So power base is informing who has developed this language, who has power over this language, right? If you have ever encountered a group where you find they're using a lot of jargon and inside jokes and you're not really feeling fully included in that group, that's kind of related to the role of power base as well. Dominant and non-dominant groups, right? Those who have created and developed the language, right? So where historically has the tradition of language come from and been developed? How might more informal language, such as the use of jargon or acronyms, be used? And who kind of has to participate within that language without necessarily having the same relationship in its development. And also the idea of polarization with regard to gender and some of the ways in which people might express themselves differently on the basis of gender. Again, this is determined in large part based on culture and sort of the cultural assumptions behind what it means to express or practice as a particular gender, right? So polarization with regard to gender is another topic that has come up in a lot of these contexts. So one of the key ideas here about how muted group theory works is the idea of silencing, right? The idea is that through the use of language and through the use of power, it prohibits or restricts individuals from the ability to fully express themselves freely, right? So one thing that we see discussed a lot in more kind of critical and culturally oriented theories is what we might consider to be the illusion of freedom, right? That while somebody might have the ability to express themselves freely, in practice, there are restrictions in place that might make it more difficult for them to do so. One example of this is the idea of ridicule, right? So if somebody is speaking a different language, if they're speaking more slowly, if they're not pronouncing something, they might be made fun of, teased from a young age. And as a result of that, they might find themselves less willing to speak up because they know that they are more likely to be hurt or made fun of. Silencing can also be ritual, right? So as a practice, perhaps maybe you're in a group setting and there are one or two people who always dominate the discussion and are always the people who are speaking out and addressing whatever topics come up in your meeting. So in a kind of ritual way, groups over time are perhaps socialized not to speak as much. Another aspect is control, right? Control through the direct use of power. For instance, cutting somebody off, finishing somebody's sentence for them, restricting somebody from being able to express their perspective. That might be another tactic of silencing. And harassment, right, which is the kind of specific and strategic targeting of a person, such as bullying, teasing, making fun of, or hurting somebody that discourages their ability to speak out as well, right? So the idea here is that while in a lot of situations, people might have the ability to speak freely in a group, that in practice, a lot of these restrictions create challenges on people's ability to articulate and engage in their views. So to combat silencing, this theory suggests that there are three primary strategies that can be utilized. One of them is reclaiming, right? So reclaiming is using the very same language and pejorative terminology, such as that are used to make fun of somebody, and using that language in a more positive way, right? Trying to reclaim and use the language in a better way. Again, really good example of this is the word queer, right? Which started in a very kind of means somebody is happy, right? So you're reading kind of an older textbook for an English class, and that term is being used in that way. It then kind of became a very pejorative way to describe members of the LGBT+ community, but currently we're seeing that term being used in a much more positive light, right? Where people are using the term queer in a more positive way. Incidentally, in disability spaces, the word crip is actually used in a similar way, right? That term has been used very negatively to describe somebody as like a crip or a cripple, but that language has actually been kind of changed. There's been the development of work, including some work I do in the area of crip theory, right, which is kind of reclaiming and using that language differently. I'm sure you can think of other terms and language used as well, right? The word slut is an example in which that word has been used more positively within the framework of kind of, sex positive spaces. There's also the idea of elevating, right, of signal boosting or supporting individuals for whom they might encounter negative experiences in spaces. So for example, perhaps you notice that you're in a group setting and everybody is talking over somebody. You have like one member of the group who's trying to raise their hand and trying to speak, but they're not really being represented or being called on within that group. You might raise your hand and say, hey, I think this person over here had something they wanted to add. So elevating can be a way of helping from your own perspective to include those other voices. And then celebrating, right? Celebrating refers to the idea of being able to recognize, affirm, and feel that the differences, including cultural difference, can be additive and beneficial to the group. Perhaps there's a way of incorporating some type of celebration or holiday or aspects of the language, right? Or incorporating a more inclusive space. For example, perhaps your meeting, there are members of the deaf community in the meeting, and the incorporation of ASL translators is able to allow that person to fully engage and share their perspectives with the group. So combating silencing is an agentic move, and it's one that's kind of recognizing some of the group and cultural dynamics that can come and be a potential problem in these types of settings. So, so this theory, muted group, does have some critique and pushback against it, right? So one of the critiques leveled against muted group theory is the idea of essentialism, right? Essentialism is about kind of reducing aspects of identity into particular identifiable categories. For instance, if we are to think about gender, right? Obviously, we know that if somebody is coming from a perspective that gender is just one part of their identity, For example, Kimberly Premshaw's work on intersectionality, right, is arguing in the ways in which people from a variety of populations and identity experiences engage with the world differently, right? She specifically does work to discuss Black women in the legal system and the challenges that they face in things such as custody that are distinct from Black men and distinct from white women. So one of the concerns here is that essentializing or boiling it down to something like gender or something like a cultural identity or first language spoken is not necessarily getting at the complexity of human experiences. And again, assuming, men are socialized this way, women are socialized this way, and not necessarily engaging in a more inclusive spectrum. Another critique here is with regard to test of time, right? This is not to say that there are differences, forms of marginalization, and power imbalances that still exist, because they very much do. It's just a question of how those things have shaped up differently, and how individuals might encounter issues of silencing, domination, and problems encountering group settings the way that they didn't before. Perhaps it's not so much that somebody has to learn a new language, so much as it is that they do not learn the native language of their culture. And then another thing that's not really considered within this theory are strategies of engagement. In other words, how might somebody utilize or kind of engage in strategies of silence that exist? Perhaps there are strategic ways to utilize silencing, for example, somebody underestimating you on the basis of not being an active participant in the group, but nevertheless doing really well in that group. So sometimes there are ways that people engage and kind of respond to tactics of silencing that this theory is not fully quite getting at. So all in a row, as I mentioned, this was an example of a play by Alex Davis that came out a few years ago. And again, it generated a lot of critique because while it was depicting a sort of family and sort of the day-to-day challenges and issues of family, one of the main characters, right, a child, was depicted rather than being a human, was depicted as a puppet. And this play again generated a lot of critique insofar as it was seen as dehumanizing, literally silencing, and not including a voice or perspective, and kind of seen as the dominant way of framing or thinking about disability, right? Oftentimes in a lot of disability scholarship spaces, there's discussion about how people with disabilities are framed as not fully human, not fully agents, that there's something missing about them, and that stereotype or trope gets used in sort of media representation as well. We think about a lot of stereotypical depictions. So there's a lot of mediated examples, right? We see this a lot in discussion about history of media, film, and television, of roles and portrayals that might be seen as racially or culturally insensitive, as well as some of the challenges of representation and including diverse perspectives in an inclusive way. So just wanted to share an example here of how muted group theory is present insofar as the dominant group's development of representation via media may not be considerate of the populations that it aims to represent or depict. So what I want us to take some time to do is a little bit different, right? So over the course of the last few weeks, we've talked about a lot of theories that bring in some contrasts in their perspectives. For instance, some differences with regard to how these theories think about and approach media. And what I would like you to do for your attendance today in groups is to pick two theories from the course that, in your opinion, in a group, disagree with each other. In other words, two theories that we've discussed so far in the course that have differences in terms of their assumptions and beliefs compared to each other. So perhaps this theory suggests media has a lot of control over our lives. This theory suggests that we have control over media. In what areas do these two theories disagree? What assumptions might they disagree on? And of those two theories, which of them does your group find to be more persuasive? So I will let you pick your own groups. You can pick anywhere from as few as 2 to as many as, say, 6 or so. So feel free to find some people you'd like to work with, have one person who will write or type for your group, and be ready to share some of your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I didn't tell him, I didn't say it. This is clarification. Yeah, didn't think he was that open. That's something. Oh, yeah. Another one. Changing the way you speak to accommodate another. And then this one is all about that. Yeah.
This one.
And what they're saying, that makes sense, right? Communication skills, like you're saying that. It's really really interesting way that they feel, communication theory. People that are more in ours. Right.
Some of the other. It has to be something that's not. Second.
Yeah. That's really easier to read.
Okay, so go ahead and wrap up your group work here. So what I'm going to ask that we do is we'll go around and I'm going to ask that you explain the two theories that you picked and what you see as the big difference between those two theories. So let's start here in.
So we did media ecology theory and uses of gratification theory. So we simply do both have a perspective like media and technology's impact on modern day life, but they disagree in regards to like how it's applied. So we said media ecology theory assumes media is dominant and sort of in a sense it's inescapable. So it's kind of forced on people, whereas UG theory assumes people voluntarily use media as it's like human needs.
Great. How about back here? Mhm. Mhm.
And so it's like basically people looking for the media, not versus
Great. How about up here?
The two theories we chose was communication accommodation theory and muted group theory.
Uh-huh.
And the differences we found was that communication accommodation theory has people try to talk like or relate with the other groups, where in the muted group theory, they would have language be what separates them.
Great. Back here?
We also did media quality uses certification, and so not to be out there, but we also felt like uses of gratification, so really like if the media we want our needs and super goal oriented, and then media ecology is media is heavily influencing us and I think it's really a reaction on society.
Over on this side?
And basically the two interpretations of one another, one that is more dramatic attention, and combination to have it all in different languages. Some people want another, for example, the healthcare, and the other alternate knowledge is the fundamentally to experience that, and in other words, transfer benefits or not have to do it. And third one is the combination work. First one is help them to get better at understanding technology.
And is this group back here or say what? Okay, great. So some things that I noticed in the contrast of theories, particularly with regard to media theories, uses and gratification is very concerned with individuals having power over media, right? Picking media that fits within our interests and expertise. Whereas some of the other theories like media ecology, it's setting, using media to set the environment for us. Along with something such as agenda setting theory, media has power to define issues. I also like this contrast between muted group theory and a communication accommodation. Insofar as muted group theory is about exerting power over others through the use of language, while accommodation is quite the opposite, using language as a means of connecting to and bridging. I think that kind of contrast is interesting because it shows different assumptions about motivations. Are we motivated to use communication for our own purposes and goals, or are we motivated to use communication as a way of engaging and trying to connect as best as we can with other people? So, you know, as you're thinking about, again, none of these theories I'm saying are correct or incorrect compared to each other. Rather, they are tools that we can continue to think about and use. So understanding some of those differences is a good idea. So to wrap up, as a reminder, Friday is an attendance optional workshop day. You're welcome to come in to prepare for your second application paper. We talked about muted group theory and some of the ways that it's utilized in relationships and marginalization. So we have an attendance optional work day, and then we'll come back next Monday to get into our final 3 theories of the term. Please pass forward or email your attendance if you haven't done so already with your group member names. Have a great rest of your day and see you next week.